Welcome everybody to a new type of video to this channel. Still playing Rebellion, Rise of the Empire. Wanted to talk a little bit about some opening philosophies here that might be useful. I know a few people have been asking for some different video types, so please leave some comments and feedback in the comment section just so you guys can let me know what you think. I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things I like to think about when I am choosing what to deploy and where. You want to make sure you're not giving the rebels any easy opportunities to score level 1 objectives. Okay, you obviously win the game by finding the rebel base, but the rebels win by scoring enough objectives to push the timeline closer. So that could be as quick as turn 6 or 7, or it could be turn 10, 11, or 12. Either way, rebels need to score some objectives to win. I have yet to see a rebel pull off a victory with scoring 0 objectives and just getting to turn 14. As the Empire, it's really important to control these first level 1 objectives. Now, level 2 objectives are generally really good, and they're hard to prevent, right? But level 1 objectives oftentimes make that difference between winning and losing a game. I've talked to a lot of people starting out, and really at any level of Imperial play, where you just wish you had that one extra turn. And a lot of times that extra turn, anytime you feel that way, look back at the objective scored and ask yourself, could I have done more to prevent any of these objectives? So if you're starting off as an Imperial player, I'd say it's really important to familiarize yourself with these level 1 rebel objectives. Now, there's a couple of them that you can't really do a whole lot about. There's base defenses, which I don't know where that card just went there. If they're going to build structures, they're going to build structures. There's only a limited amount you can do on that. Long War is obviously another one that you can't control. Defend the People is relatively easy to control naturally, so I left that one off. We're not going to talk extensively about that one. Rebels have 3 combat objectives that could be scored turn 1 if you're not careful. Okay, Crippling Blow, 3 Imperial health units, kill 1 Imperial Star Destroyer, and Decisive Victory. Rebel Assault and Crippling Blow both have to be attacks initiated by the rebels. They also have Regional Support, which usually they can't score turn 1 without some extra cards. Support of the Huts and Cut Supply Lines. So it's important to know what those do and how to guard against those, not necessarily on turn 1, but on the early turns after. So pay careful attention to what the rebels are sabotaging, if they're sabotaging, whether or not they're building loyalty in, the Nal Hutta region, or if they're building loyalty in one of the easy to control regions like Megiddo, or Ord, Bespin, or Mustafar, right? So when you're the Empire, take a look at your board and notice what your weak regions are, right? In this particular setup, I have both Ord and Megiddo that are neutral. That means 2 build alliances and they can score regional aid. Okay, Bespin is not controlled, but Mustafar is, so it will still take 3 loyalty cards to get regional aid there. Same as Nal Hutta, the region, they only need 2 to score support of the Huts. And another one that often gets away from the Empire is the Naboo, Utapau, Salust sort of combination here. Oftentimes the rebels will start out with Naboo, they'll build alliance in Utapau, and maybe the Imperials have a subjugated Salust, right? So Empire might go and subjugate Naboo, and then rebels might even try to throw the Empire off by, sabotaging Salust to pull your attention away from it. Then the following turn, at the end of the round, they might build an alliance in Salust, and then all of a sudden, boom, they have regional aid. So that one has gotten away from me a few times. So back to Imperial Deployment. So we want to think about level 1 rebel objectives. So get familiar with those, right? And our deployment will reflect that here. Look at the loyalty situation on the board and where are you vulnerable, and do you need to guard against that on turn 1? You're going to want to think about what you're building, right? Whether or not you've got a loyal Corellia or you want to try to turn Corellia normal. We'll talk about that. So yeah, what you want to build, what the objectives the rebels could have is, what the rebel loyalty situation is, Imperial loyalty situation, and also what missions the rebels might be on up here. When the game starts, everybody will have played their action cards. Okay, these are another set of action cards you should be familiar with. Now, if you lay these out, you'll notice that the rebels have 4 cards that you'll know about pretty much immediately. Now, I know Mothma's is not a immediate. However, in most circumstances in base setup, Temporary Alliance will be played on Utapau before the rebels even assign their mission. Okay, you've got C-3PO, which guarantees diplomacy passing. You've got R2, which makes Leia a monster at blocking missions. And Rebel Extremist, that will get played. Whether or not they take Saw is a whole different topic. If they do not play any immediate cards and Temporary Alliance does not pop down, oftentimes the rebels might be on false orders, okay, because there's only 4 other cards and they'll likely have 2 of these. So if you think the rebels are on false orders, you might want to play your missions a little bit differently. Dodanas and Ricans almost never get played early. Sometimes Leia's card will get played early to pull out a established trade relations or a support of the Mon Cal, something along that lines. So when you're deploying, we can look at this board here and we can say, okay, we've got a loyal Mon Cal. We definitely want to prevent rebels from building a cruiser. We've got a loyal Kashyyyk, which generates 2 ground units. Okay, that's probably the least valuable to us here. And then we've got Bathui, which has a speeder generation here. But for the purposes of deployment, a good way to think about deploying early is, and kind of a good default, is 1 Star Destroyer and 1 Assault Carrier in 3 different deployment groups, and then keeping your Death Star in a separate deployment group. Now, why do I say that? It's specifically for this card here, Rebel Assault. Okay, so what could the rebels attack with, right? They could attack with a transport, they could attack with a couple of Y-Wings, they could attack with a Corvette and some X-Wings. So cards they can play that go along with that, depending on how aggressive they want to be, they could start with a bombing run to load 2 damage onto a Star Destroyer, and then all of a sudden they're rolling 3 red dice, between 1 and 3 black dice, and then they have 2 rerolls with Dodana. So, even if you were to play Imposing Presence to block some red hits, there's a pretty decent chance that if you leave a single Star Destroyer alone, that it's going to be open to some form of attack, right? At a bare minimum, even if the rebels aren't going to kill it on turn 1, you're going to have to commit a leader to that defense to make sure that your Star Destroyer can withdraw if you leave it alone. So leaving a single Star Destroyer by itself, or a single TIE fighter with that Star Destroyer, maybe not the best move, simply because of that, because of the Rebel Assault objective card. Okay, so that's why I generally recommend deploying 3 groups like this. Similarly, Decisive Victory you need to think about. Again, a less common first round to be scored, but if you have a single assault carrier sitting on top of 2 stormtroopers, or maybe an assault carrier and a couple TIE fighters and a couple of stormtroopers underneath it, well, that's a prime target for the rebels to, commit their whole fleet to scoring Decisive Victory on turn 1. So by pairing a Star Destroyer and an assault carrier, when you roll your defensive dice, you're going to have 3 dice to try to roll a heal or to do damage with. Instead of just 2, you're going to have more black dice. If your deployment, which kind of standard deployment would probably come with 3 TIE fighters. So then you're rolling 5 black dice, 3 red dice, and whether or not you put a leader there, it can be a fairly intimidating dice roll for the rebels to try to get confident and attack. With the 3 TIE fighters, especially rolling second, there's a reasonable chance you're going to roll 3 black hits or so, which will wipe functionally the rebel fleet. And even if you don't heal the Star Destroyer, you may kill the Corvette or the transport, which pretty brutal. So try to make that decision for the rebels to attack one of your Star Destroyers early expensive for them if they do it. And worse, the rebels have to consider the damage that's done if the Emperor plops in and says hello on this sort of issue, right? Now their dice roll becomes 1 black and 2 red, and they likely don't play bombing run. They likely play, the transport card or the cancel card from the Corvette if this pops up. But that being said, then the Emperor might retreat, might drop, or if the rebels retreat, the Empire might track them. It can unravel quickly for the rebel player if the Empire drops according to my design with that sort of fleet deployment on there. So let's talk about where we might go with these navies, right? Well, we know for sure we want to go after Mon Cal. We might go after Kashyyyk. We know we want to go after Bothawui, right? So let's go ahead and just deploy these guys here. Where you want to put this last fleet. So we have some options, right? We can put this fleet in Coruscant and use it to cover Karelia or Ord. Or we could put this fleet over in Seleucid and then head up to Naboo, Utapau, cover this corner over here, okay? Think about which way you're likely to expand to and make sure you have fleets that can head in that direction. Okay, if I deploy my fleet like this, the rebels most likely are not going to pick Tatooine. They're probably less likely to pick Hoth and Endor, more likely to pick planets in this region over here, right? Death Star can still get over there, but it's kind of tough to do. If we flip-flop and we put maybe the Death Star over here, we put the fleet over here in Coruscant, that might be a little bit more flexible. We can cover Karelia. We can also threaten to head out this direction. So something like this is probably what I would do, with the concept of, maybe having the Death Star head in this direction. Maybe having, an assault carrier head out to here, Star Destroyer head over this way, one this way, one this way. There's lots of routes where we can go here. So all things to think about. Okay, another common card dropped on turn 1, Crippling Blow. Okay, so try not to leave 3 health of anything sitting anywhere. If I drop 3 stormtroopers somewhere, the rebels bring maybe 5 troops or 3 troops and a speeder or something like that. They can easily win that fight, whether or not the space battle lives. Right, so a pretty standard thing to do would be the rebels would fly in with just these 2, leave these units in the base, maybe bring 5 troops or 6 troops and leave these 3 behind, end up wiping these, maybe we get lucky and kill 3 or 4 troopers, and then they score Crippling Blow. Again, Crippling Blow, they do not need to win the combat. Okay, that's a big misconception. They only need to destroy 3 health worth of ground units in a combat they started, right? And they can definitely kill 1 with hold them back, and then they have enough damage cards where they can pretty much guarantee enough kills to kill something that's easily sitting behind. Now, they don't have any vanguards that they start out with in base deployment, so you don't necessarily need to worry about the ATSTs, getting sniped, but 3 stormtroopers pretty easy to do. Okay, so let's talk about what should be under these fleets. So one of these 4 groups will likely have a minimum unit starting underneath it. So what that could look like, let's say it's the Death Star group over here, that could look like 1 ATST, or it could look like 2 stormtroopers. Okay, either one of these are not subject to Crippling Blow. And then what might this Death Star do? Right, the Death Star could go to Bespin, bring everything, or let's say it goes with 2 stormtroopers if you were planning on subjugating with it, right? Then the next round it goes to Hoth, leaves a stormtrooper behind, brings its TIE fighters with it. Then it goes to Endor. Then lastly it goes to Hoth to check for the rebel base, right? Leaves a TIE fighter behind to make sure they can't rapid to that location later. right? So not a bad way to do it. If you're going to start with the Death Star over here in Mandalore, for example, instead of the 2 troopers, maybe you start with the ATST. If you have an ATST over here, then you don't need to worry so much about subjugating. So you have the ATST, head off to Dathomir, leave a TIE fighter, or head off to Yavin, leave a TIE fighter, then go to Dathomir, leave another TIE fighter, then go to Dantooine. You know, now you've got a relatively undefended Death Star out in a remote planet. Nothing bad has ever happened in that before. So one group, oftentimes the Death Star, should have either 2 stormtroopers or 1 ATST on it. Let's say we start the Death Star over in Mustafar. We're going to stick our 2 stormtroopers under there because we want to suggest we might be going to Bespin. Okay, that gives us the next layer of deployment to think about. So we've got machines rolling red dice and black dice, and then we have stormtroopers that roll just black dice. One thing that gets overlooked sometimes is if you're going to be doing attacking or defending, sometimes it's helpful to have like dice together, right? So if I do some sort of deployment where I'm going to do maybe 2 ATSTs and 2 stormtroopers somewhere, if those ATSTs get attacked by anything, public uprising or incite rebellion or whatever, the ATSTs are only rolling 2 red dice for heals, right? You can do a deployment if you think most of your heavy-duty fighting is going to be done in one sector. You might try putting all ATSTs and AT-ATs together. Try to maximize your 5 red dice. I've seen that done a few times, has some interesting pros and cons to it, but since we're doing beginning opening, let's talk about what I like to do in the beginning. Okay. Coruscant, I like to put the AT-AT there, I like to put an ATST there, and I like to put 2 stormtroopers. Why? This is what I need for planetary conquest. It is a nice, difficult thing to attack, right? Even if the rebels bring everything, 6 troops and a couple of speeders, you know, they have to spend tow cables to get rid of the AT-AT. They're probably going to lose, they're going to have to commit a massive force to try to beat this. This is the least attractive target to take down on turn 1, in my opinion. So I always like to leave planetary conquest material on Coruscant. There's a decent chance you're going to draw that during the game, and it's nice to have something you can just deploy and have it all set up ready to go. Okay, next, what else do we have left? We have 2 fleets, and we have 2 groups of ATSTs. So let's split those up. 2 ATSTs in Rhodia, 2 ATSTs in Seleucami, right? We need 1 stormtrooper in each other subjugated area where we don't have a fleet. So we need 1 in Seleucid, we need 1 in Mandalore, and we have these remaining stormtroopers here. So we can stick 3 on Seleucami, and then if we wanted to, we could drop 3 into Rhodia. If I have more things to do in one specific location, sometimes I'll put the extra stormtrooper there instead. So for example, if I know for sure I'm going to Corellia and I might also go to Ord, I'll leave the extra stormtrooper here. In this instance, I might go to Kashyyyk and I might go to Mon Cal, so I'll actually put the extra stormtrooper here. Or you want to think about what is the most damage that the rebels can do if they attack, right? And they wipe the ground forces. What's the most detrimental area that could happen? In this case, it would probably be up here, so I'll add the extra trooper there. So what did we do with our takeaway? Planetary Conquest Force and Coruscant. Now, I would have done that same thing even if I had decided to put the Death Star here instead. Still Planetary Conquest Force. Okay, then I just would have set the stormtrooper or the carrier and the stormtroopers up here. So that's it. 1, 2, 3 major armies, 3 major fleets, and then a smaller kind of expeditionary force. So talked about loyalty. Weak points we have are here for loyalty in Ord and Megiddo. We got to watch for regional aid. We talked about deploying in a way that doesn't give the rebels any easy objectives to score on turn 1. And then we talked a little bit about what type of builds we want to get. Always want to keep our eye on capital ships at the beginning of the game. So just to make things easy this game, we're going to say they kind of do a standard deployment where they put 3 troops in Utapau to ensure Build Alliance goes through, and then they're going to plop everything else in the base. Okay. If the rebels have more than 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I got asked that question the other day. Why 3 in Utapau? It's because it puts 11 units in the base. So if a Gather Intel gets played, even if it doesn't get blocked, Empire's only drawing 2 cards. If Leia is behind to block something, which is often the case if you're going to go 3 troopers in Utapau because you want to discourage the Imperial from playing Gather Intel, a lot of the times you'll keep Leia behind. It is not very attractive for either Palpatine or Tarkin to try to force a Gather Intel through on Leia. It's not likely to succeed, right? Okay, so what can the Rebels play turn 1 that can be, kind of back-breaking missions, right? There's only so many cards in the base deck that will get played turn 1 reliably. The rote deck has quite a few more, so you can always hover over your opponent's decks here to see what they have. Depending on which deck they have, it will highlight when you zoom over it. Pretty common with this type of setup is to keep somebody back. So what do you normally see? Well, you're always going to see Mothma on something, and if you're playing Empire, you're hoping it's Build Alliance. You're probably going to see either Dodonna or Leia on a mission, and then you're probably going to see Riken on a mission. So those could be any number of things, and oftentimes the missions that they're on will be dictated by what level 1 objectives they have. If you see all 4 rebels on a mission, it's unlikely that it's the 4 starting missions. Oftentimes you'll see Leia back or Dodonna back if they're planning an attack. You'll see 3 leaders on. But if you see 4 leaders on, it usually means some of these cards are getting played. So in the base deck, if your opponent's playing base, oftentimes that 4th card is Incite Rebellion. Maybe they're going to try to do an Incite Rebellion, and a Subjugated Corellia might be a location. Sometimes it means that Mothma is on trade relations. It could also be support of the Mon Cal. That tends to get played fairly early. It could also be contingency plan. Now, there's not a whole lot you can do about that to play around any of those. You can be cognizant of Incite Rebellion, which that'll bring me to Imperial missions here in a minute and why I don't like to play turn 1 captures very often. But that's a card you can think about. Now, if they're playing the rote deck, there's a number of extra cards that might come into play. Okay, either the recruiting cards will typically get played turn 1. It just helps the rebels get leader turn advantage. And behind enemy lines is sort of like a Incite Rebellion without the attempt. It just happens, right? So if you try to if Leia infiltrates in subjugated planet, Vader captures Leia, then Riken shows up with behind enemy lines and wipes Vader, right? The subjugated planet had 1 stormtrooper, they bring a handful of troops in, and Vader's dead on turn 1. Pretty bad. Safe Haven sometimes gets played in conjunction with Temporary Alliance, so you'll have Mothma on Utapau, which triggers space in turn 3 of the build queue, and then Leia will drop Safe Haven, deploy those ships, and then maybe Riken builds Alliance. It's not super common, but you do see it from time to time. Regional Aid is also pretty tough. If there's not a lot you can do to deal with that. If Mothma plays Regional Aid, they might, you might be looking at way too much Rebel loyalty on turn 1 already. So again, you can't really plan for the diplomacy missions, but just get your haggles up if all 4 leaders are on missions and there's no saw behind. It means there's usually a good mission being played. It's usually not the 4 starting missions. So back to Empire. Let's say we've got Riken, Mothma, and Dodonna all on missions. What are we hoping to draw as the Empire? So I like to grab Planetary Conquest if it shows up. I like Tarkin's card if it shows up. I like Promotion if I'm playing the rote deck. Collect Bounty, maybe. Subversion, maybe. Any of the diplomacy cards are worth consideration, right? To a lesser extent, maybe Imperial Propaganda, maybe Deployment. Okay, secret weapons research, kind of unique. Only certain times I'll play that. Address delays, maybe not the worst thing. And then I put some kind of trap cards out here that sometimes throw people off a little bit. So what would we play and when? Almost always you're going to have at least 2 things you need to subjugate, right? So that's going to take 2 leaders off the board immediately, keeping two available to move, right? You have to be able to have 2 movements to subjugate these 2 planets, maybe 3 to subjugate Bothawui as well, or to subjugate Kashyyyk as well. Okay, then your next decision is going to be made by if Leia is back or not. Okay, if there's a rebel fleet next to something and they have Dodonna back, it probably means they're planning on attacking with Dodonna. But you still need to respect the fact that Dodonna has 2 intel and might block a gather intel, right? And the rebels can generally wait out that move. So if Leia's back, or maybe to a lesser extent if Dodonna's back, maybe not worth playing gather intel. In some instances, it might not be worth playing Display of Power, even if you draw that, or Message from High Command, 2 of the best diplomacy cards. Why? If you're only rolling 3 with the Emperor, that's fairly easy to block if rebels are blocking with 2 and they win on a tie, right? You're going to have to roll 3 successes to feel pretty comfortable with that, and even then, Leia can still pull off a block. Oftentimes, if Leia's back, I will not play a diplomacy card turn 1, and I'll take a sure thing instead. It is better, in my opinion, to know for sure that you can get an assault carrier built in Ord Mantell rather than trying to pull off a Display of Power in Mon Cal and risking losing the block to Leia and then still just having to subjugate it later. Or trying to do trade negotiations in Corellia and trying to get that pulled off. Now, if you do want to go the route of trying to build a Star Destroyer and you don't want to take the sure thing that is the assault carrier build, the way to do that is to open by going to Corellia. You go to Corellia with Vader, you bring some guys along for the ride, and then you're going to have the Emperor on, rule by fear. If you're doing that, now you're rolling 5 dice against Leia's 2, and that feels a little bit better. The rebels may see that there is the Emperor on what could be rule by fear, right? And this could include even if you had a subjugated Corellia. And instead of waiting for you to play that, the rebels may open with the sabotage and stick Reek here and sabotage Corellia. Then your rule by fear is for nothing because you don't have our research and development out. So now if you want your rule by fear not to be wasted, well, now you got to block with Vader, and then you got to still try to rule by fear with Palpatine. And then when Leia comes in, it's 5v3, and then that roll may not go in your favor, and then you've wasted a ton of effort to get that done. So really just kind of depends on how much you want to gamble. And early on in these games, I like to try to gamble at a minimum. Oftentimes, where we're going with that is there will be times where I have all 4 leaders back, especially if there's no troops on Utapau. Okay, let's say the rebels deployed in, Hoth. They put their guys in Hoth. They wanted to attack the Death Star. They wanted to drop some troops off, and they wanted to blockade my production of a assault carrier here. Seems reasonable. If that's the case, I almost definitely keep the Emperor back, because if Mothma drops a build alliance, we're rolling 3v3 instead of 5v3. Build alliance gives you 2 extra dice if you have troops on Utapau, so 5v3 doesn't feel very good. 3v3, I think I take that all day. Crippling the rebels on turn 1 by not allowing them to get both units is pretty good. Okay, one more thought process on that. So if the rebels open with trade relations, and they do say trade relations on a subjugated Corellia because they don't want you to rule by fear there, right? So maybe they turn that loyal. Rather than trying to block the trade relations, save the Emperor and block the Build Alliance that's done by Dodonna or Riken or Leia. Now you're 3v2, even if they try to do it in Utapau where there's 3 troops. You know, if it's Leia, it's 4v3. If it's Riken, it's 3v3. I still take that role. Don't block the trade relations, block the Build Alliance. So Infiltration and Rapid. Sometimes Rebel players like to play Rapid instead of Sabotage. That might be if the base is close by and they think they might kind of trap kill one of your leaders. Oftentimes they'll open with a Rapid because that guarantees Riken is on the base that you're attacking. So if you see Rapid as the first turn, get your haggles up a little bit and think real hard about what you're bringing and where. If you see Infiltrate, it means there's probably no other backbreaker cards that the Rebels are coming out with. Now, I've been asked before, do I block Infiltrate? I've thought about blocking Infiltrate lots of times. And Cookie actually gave me some good advice with that. He said, look, you don't want to block Infiltrate, you want to punish Infiltrate. So if you're seeing lots of Rebel infiltration and you don't like it, don't counter it with a block necessarily, counter it with a capture. Because if you capture, they're not infiltrating the next round, and instead of infiltrating, they're spending their intel doing a rescue. So anyway, if the Rebels want to infiltrate, give it to them. They're going to be shuffling through these level 1 cards anyway, trying to pick the best of kind of mediocre conditions for the first round, or first couple rounds. So diplomacy missions, hit or miss, depending on if Leia's back. If Leia's on a mission, I'll run diplomacy first turn all the time. Planetary Conquest. I like Planetary Conquest if I'm expecting them to build alliance in Utapau, right? Which is almost always, especially if there's 3 troops here. Mothma on Utapau, followed by Vader doing a planetary conquest there, bringing these guys along for the ride. Again, also a good reason to deploy a planetary conquest group down somewhere. You don't necessarily have to bring all of them, but you certainly can. Use up their build alliance and then prevent them from building, or if they used established trade relations there, prevent them from building a second, or if they used established trade relations and temporary alliance, prevent them from building a third. Wipe their troops, and you get an assault carrier out of the deal. If you're playing the rote deck, I almost always play promotion on turn 1. Oftentimes I'll turn that into Krennic's Finest. I don't usually play higher mercenaries if I have that on turn 1. I value the extra move that Krennic's Finest can give more than, say, grabbing Boba Fett. I almost never use higher mercenaries early to grab Jabba because you want to grab Jabba with his card that gives you bonus leaders if possible. If you hire Jabba as a mercenary and then draw Jabba's card later, and now all of a sudden you're taking Mahdi as your leader, and I hate that, especially if you started with Mahdi. Okay, what other cards do I like? Collect Bounty, capture Mothma on turn 1 on Utapau. Collect Bounty gives you the option to grab any leader. Savvy Rebel leaders, if Vader's on a mission, will try to play around capture Rebel operative. Let's think about this. This is why I brought Lure out too. So this is a big mistake if you try to Lure on turn 1 as well. So let's say you have something like this set up. Rebels are going to be super concerned about their leader if they're paying attention. So maybe they open with Rapid, right? They stick Riken and Rapid. You go and subjugate Mon Cal. Then Mothma comes out and does build alliance out in Utapau. Okay, fine. Now we're going to go to Bothui and subjugate that. Now they've got Leia and Dodonna. Dodonna's on Infiltrate. Well, if I'm the Rebel, I probably just drop Leia somewhere. That's maybe by Mothma. And now it's the Empire's turn, and I have nobody to capture, which means I have to pass with Vader, and then I have to pass with Palpatine. And then the Rebels still get their Infiltrate off. A savvy Rebel will guard against the dynamic duo on first turn, capture Lure. So Lure is a trap card, don't play it, unless you have Collect Bounty, and then Lure and Collect Bounty is fairly flexible. I'd be okay with Lure if you had Bounty, but not if you just have capture Rebel operative. Okay, Tarkin's card's nice for lots of reasons. You can strip the loyalty off Utapau without having to battle Mothma for it. Right, so that could look like Death Star to Seleucid and then gain loyalty there and strip the loyalty here, or gain it in Naboo and strip it in Utapau. So I like Tarkin's card, obviously. That's probably the best Imperial card on turn 1 that you could draw, simply because it strips the loyalty out of Utapau without having to roll for it. I also really like Subversion. If you have Subversion, that's typically probably the only card that anybody's on. Emperor on Subversion gives the idea you might be on a rule by fear. Mothma plays Build Alliance in Utapau. I probably don't play Subversion if it's 3 in Utapau, because now I'm rolling 5v4. But if the rebels are somewhere else, now if Mothma tries to build Alliance in Utapau, well, I can subvert it. I'm rolling 4, and the rebels are only rolling 3. And that feels pretty good for being able to block, especially because block wins on a tie. So Subversion is if there's no rebels on Utapau and instead they're attacking, trying to score objectives or cut supply lines or whatever, that's real nice to keep the Emperor on. When in doubt, a good default is just to stick Tarkin on a card. Keep your other guys back for moving. If you keep your Emperor back, they have to think about according to my design, so they're not going to do any crazy attacking, or will be less likely to do that. If you have Tarkin on a card, well, they have to respect a number of different options. Tarkin could be on Rule by Fear, Gather Intel, and Research and Development. So let's say, again, we go back to our deployment in Utapau over here. If you have a loyal Corellia, or you have a loyal Mustafar, or God forbid you have both. I don't think that's ever happened to me once. I'm sure somebody's disagreeing with that right now. If the rebels want to get aggressive, they could sabotage Corellia. But if Tarkin's on a card, that's risking you just flipping over R&D and removing the sabotage. They could build Alliance in Utapau early and try to keep the tempo in their favor, but that risks Tarkin being on Fear will keep them in line. That's extra bad if they also have Naboo. Maybe you start with Star Destroyer or even the Death Star, and you move Death Star over to Celeste, and then you flip over with Tarkin's card, and now you're rolling 3+2 against Leia. That probably works. You strip all their loyalty on turn 1. It's brutal. This card's absolutely brutal to have on turn 1. Especially with Naboo loyalty. And then Gather Intel, if they decide to attack with Leia and they don't have anybody left to block, all Tarkin needs is just 1 success on any rebel system, and then he's drawing two probes if you've got 7 in the base. So if you're not sure exactly what to do, just default to putting Tarkin on a card, just because it'll make the rebels think. Even if they have Leia back somewhere, you could still make a move, in this particular setup. You could take a move where you move, Palps to Corellia, and then if they don't sabotage it, because they don't want to risk the 1 roll and they didn't do it with their first, you bring Tarkin in, you're rolling 4v2 or 4v3. There's so decent chance that Rule by Fear goes off. You just want to pair him with, you want to move somebody to a place where you'll benefit from a Rule by Fear. So that's kind of Imperial basics and what to think about. I guess I'll mention these last couple here. Propaganda is like a lesser version of Tarkin's card, generally. It can be more devastating, but it serves the purpose of removing Utapau and Naboo. So if you have a loyal Naboo, or if the rebels have a loyal Naboo and you draw Propaganda, you could drop Vader or Emperor on that and probably get away with that first turn. Deployment is like a worse version of trade negotiations early on. I like to not use that turn 1. Address delay and secret weapons research. I only put these out here because of the consideration of a couple of things out here. Sometimes if the rebels have SAW, you cannot wait the rebels out for sabotage. So normally if you have Tarkin on R&D, rebels go, Empire goes back and forth, you're going to get the last say. So if the last thing the rebel does is sabotage, then the last thing you do is Tarkin's research and development and pull it off, right? If they have SAW, the rebels are going to get last move. The only way to consider protecting Corellia is either with a block or dropping tag on secret weapons research in Corellia. You get 2 project cards instead of 1. By playing secret weapons research, that does give you a defensive roll. SAW rolls 1+2, tag rolls 1. You still win on a on a tie. You know, likely you lose it, but at least gives you a chance, and gets you 2 project cards and discourages the rebel from trying in Corellia, where they might try to block your, maybe your assault carrier. They might take the sure thing, especially if they have cut supply lines. So every once in a blue moon, if the rebels have saw, I will play secret weapons research on my first turn, or address delays with the same concept. So hopefully that gives you guys some opening ideas. Again, as a recap, take a look at the loyalty, figure out where your weak points are and where you're vulnerable. Think about rebel objectives. Make sure you're not giving them an easy decisive victory, an easy target for rebel assault, or an easy target for crippling blow. Pay attention to if they seem to be going after Nalhutta, or if they seem to be going after your easy to get areas. Or if they start with Naboo and you don't have Celeste Loyal, that's another vulnerable spot. See where they're sabotaging, and if they use their fleet to block a location for cut supply lines. Everything else you can kind of get a pretty good idea of what they're doing and how to prevent them from scoring any easy objectives turn 1. And then just keep in mind your long-term goals. Where do you want things moved to? Where are you anticipating fighting? If they have a large group in Utapau, don't move your assault carrier to Naboo. If you want to get to Utapau turn 2, you might get attacked. You might get hit and ran for the assault carrier. Move your assault carriers to the places where you are not as concerned about if they get defeated. If you're concerned about getting confronted, bring an ATST and a troop and a TIE fighter. That means to confront, they're going to have to kill both of these, and I'm going to have to not get anything that survives. I can retreat. Obviously, that doesn't happen if the assault carrier dies, but gives me more than just one single stormtrooper. Thanks to everybody for watching. Let me know in the comments if this was helpful, and if so, I will follow up with a Rebel one, and then we'll talk about some mid-game strategies with the Empire next. Okay, thanks everyone. See you around. Bye.